One of the best handhelds that I've tried this year is the TrimUI Smart Pro. This one just stood out, and I think the reason why is because it copied the Vita design. I had a Vita, but I didn't really have it for very long. So why am I talking about the TrimUI Smart Pro? So this is what I wanted to answer. I'm curious to see if two of my favorite devices coming together can make something even better. This thing has a lot going for it, especially in the portability department. The Odin 2 has some good ergonomics, a beautiful screen, and also some pretty decent joysticks. One thing this thing has though is a ton of power, so what happens if you mix these two together? You can only get something good out of it, right? Well, let's check it out. AYN did send this over for a review, but they're not seeing this review beforehand. All opinions are my own, and I'll give you my honest thoughts to what I think about it. So before we jump into it, let's take a closer look to see what this thing costs and what exactly it is. On their website, they have two different versions. We have the base model and the pro model. Currently, as of writing this review, the base model goes for $340 US. The pro is $399. The base model is only available in black, so if you want that white, you'll have to jump up to the pro model. As far as performance goes, this is very similar to the Odin 2. We have almost identical specs. We have the same Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 with a 1080p panel. However, the panel is one of the biggest differences. This is mini LED. I did see a little bit of a dark bezel around the screen, so we'll have to take a closer look at that once we get into the device. This comes preloaded with Android 13 and a 5000 mAh battery. We still have those Hall sticks though, but we lose about 100 grams to the device weight. The base model only comes with 8 gigs of RAM and 128 gigs of storage. Jumping up to that Pro model will get you that 12 gigs of RAM with 256 gigs of storage. If I was to buy one of these today, I would probably get the base model. I don't think Android needs 12 gigs of RAM, and 128 gigs is more than enough because you have that micro SD card slot. In the rare circumstance that you use 8 gigs of RAM, they also have a swap file in the OS itself to extend that a little bit further. So essentially we have a different form factor, a different screen, and a smaller battery. I like a bright screen, so I'm curious to see how 1100 nits translates to this panel. I've also never used a mini LED, so I'm kind of curious to see what this looks like. Mini LEDs in theory get you a brighter display, and you can get some better contrast, similar to an OLED. Obviously OLED is going to look nicer, but it does essentially boost that a little bit further than your standard LCD. So you're going to get darker blacks, because it can essentially shut off different quadrants of your screen if there's nothing in them. As far as the actual zones go, there's 384 zones. This is more than my television, so I'm not really concerned too much about any blooming, but we'll take a closer look at that. AYN is also stating that this is going to start shipping in late June. I do hope this is pretty accurate because they do seem to be on track so far. Until the 21st as well, if you use this code, you can get $10 off your pre-order. The only other standalone features are we have Wi-Fi 7, there's the latest Bluetooth 5.3, we have active cooling, we get some analog triggers. But all in all, this just looks like a really solid device. I'm kind of concerned about the battery life though, because 5000 mAh is pretty small. But we might as well open this up and take a closer look at the device itself. If you are ordering this, you don't get a charger. I think for $20 US, their little mini 65 watt charger might be a good idea. So my pick between the two, I think the base model has more value. But if you can justify the Pro and you don't want to have a micro SD card slot in it, the extra storage and more RAM might be worth it. Let me know which model you think's the better buy. Okay, let's take a closer look inside the box and see what we get. Inside the box, we get a nice little spec sheet. I really like how they've started to include these. This looks really professional, and it gives us a nice overlay of the device. It's also wrapped really good in the box. We have the device itself. This is something that I haven't seen before from any company. They've actually included a very nice power cable. This is also USB-C to USB-C. I actually really like this. I was in the market for a nice USB cable for this device anyways, so that's good to see that they shipped it with one. There's nothing else in the box though, so let's set this aside and take a closer look at the device. First impressions of the device, this thing is so small. I think this thing feels the same size as the TrimUI Smart Pro. In fact, they're pretty dang similar. These are almost the same size device. Obviously, the Odin 2 Mini is just a hair larger. Picking this up first, it feels very high quality. This feels about what you would expect from AYN. The Odin 2 felt like a very high quality device, and this is no different. But first impressions are pretty good. How does it stack up to some other devices? Let's take a closer look. Well, as mentioned, the TrimUI Smart Pro is very similar in size. The Smart Pro comes out to about 80mm tall. The Odin 2 Mini is 86.1mm. If we're looking at the screens themselves, the TrimUI Smart Pro has a screen that's 121.4mm wide. The Odin 2 Mini is only slightly larger at 124.6mm. In fact, these two devices share more similarities than any other two devices that I own. One area where these two devices differ is definitely the thickness. The TrimUI Smart Pro is pretty thin. The TrimUI Smart Pro is 17.2mm. If we look at the Odin 2 Mini, it's 19.5mm thick, so only a hair thicker. If we compare this to the Odin 2, the device comes out to its thickest point at 30.9mm. That's in large part thanks to these grips on the back. These grips sure add to the overall comfort of using this device, but they make it hard to fit in your pocket. Size-wise, the only other device that I have that comes close to this is the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro. The triggers stick out quite a bit though. If you try to take this with you, these do stick out in your pocket quite a bit. However, one thing that the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro has going for it is the color. I love this red, and I think Retroid definitely nailed it. Do I wish the Odin 2 Mini came in this red? Absolutely. So out of all the devices that I own, it's most similar to the TrimUI Smart Pro, but it has the power of the Odin 2. Obviously, these two handhelds are very different, but let's see how the Odin 2 Mini stacks up to the ROG Ally. There's no comparison, is there? The ROG Ally is just so much bigger. However, this is pretty portable for an x86 device. This, however, is extremely portable for an ARM device. This is ARM at its most portable, and this is mainstream x86 handhelds at their most portable. Yeah, there's quite a difference, isn't there? The ROG Ally definitely has some better ergonomics. The lightest device that I own is probably the Mio Mini Plus. This thing weighs 162 grams, so it's pretty light. The TrimUI Smart Pro comes out to 253 grams. The Retroid Pocket 4 Pro comes out to 274 grams. The Odin 2 Mini comes out to 323 grams. The original Odin 2 comes out to 424 grams. And the ROG Ally comes out to 630 grams. So the Odin 2 Mini is 323 grams. That's ever so slightly heavier than the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, but I do think that that weight makes it feel like a higher quality device. I think they got this down to a really good weight. Overall, the build quality feels really good. This is a pretty solid device. It has very similar plastic to the Odin 2 and the Loki Max that I had. This back part is very grippy. It does show fingerprints, but it's not too bad. So I think they did a pretty good job. All the buttons and the inputs, as well as the joysticks, feel high quality. The plastic on this unit is also the final retail version too. The only thing that AYN has shared with me in mine that's different than the retail unit is going to be these bumpers. However, the bumpers in mine feel really good, so I'm not sure why these aren't stock. As far as the build quality goes, I really have no complaints. This feels like a solid device. If you like how the Odin 2 feels, the Odin 2 Mini is pretty much the same kind of quality. First up, let's talk about these joysticks. If you own the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, you already know what these feel like. These are exactly the same joysticks. In fact, if we look at these devices side by side, they both look like they come out of the device the same. But we can measure this too. On the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, the joysticks protrude out about 5.2mm. These are pretty recessed, but you do make some sacrifices as far as pocketability goes. And if we compare this to the Odin 2 Mini, yeah, they stick out exactly 5.2mm. Pocketability is where the TrimUI Smart Pro is going to excel. These barely stick out of the device. In fact, they're pretty much almost in line with it. These are Vita joysticks. These only stick out 2.6mm out of the front of the device. Compare that to the Odin 2 at 6.5mm and there's just no comparison. When you're playing the Odin 2, these feel much more comfortable to use. Even without joystick caps, I still think these are very comfortable joysticks. Because the right one is further down, having it a little higher up also makes for a little bit easier comfort on that side. On the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, these are both in the bottom, and because of that reason, I've never really liked using joysticks on this device. They're okay, but you probably want some of those switch covers just to add a little bit of height. So I do think that these joysticks are usable as is, but I do wish they were a little bit taller. However, since this is a mini version, I believe that they were going for portability as the biggest factor. But overall, yeah, the joysticks aren't too bad, and I don't mind them. The joysticks have a slight concave cap, and they're very rubbery, so they have a lot of grip. I'm also not hearing any clicking or grinding as I'm turning these joysticks. They have L3 and R3 functionality, and they have a nice hollow click to them. If I try to get a really close-up view of these, you can kind of see that there's a little bit of texture on them. All in all, these are not bad joysticks. They don't have an LED ring around the outside, but I think that's okay. And I actually kind of like the minimalistic design. So while I wish these were a little taller, I am willing to make that sacrifice just for a little bit more pocketability. This replaces an x86 handheld in my bag. However, the TrimUI Smart Pro and the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro are small enough to fit in any pocket that I have, and they're much easier to take around. I think this is going to solve the Odin 2's biggest problem, and that's portability. If the Odin 2 is in my Tomtoc sling, I can't fit an x86 handheld, but I can bring either one of these devices with me and still have room for an x86 device. So I love the portability, and I think these are good joysticks. Let's take a closer look at the triggers and the buttons next. Starting with the buttons, they have a nice rubber membrane connection to them. You can see the lettering on these, and they're etched in pretty nice. I don't believe these are completely transparent, and if you look at the very bottom, you can kind of see that. They are extremely glossy though, and they do attract fingerprints. These might scratch over time, but I think these are good face buttons all in all. They're a decent size, and they're spaced out far enough apart. If you've seen any of my other reviews, you know I like face buttons around 10mm. These are way smaller at only 7.2mm, but they're definitely bigger than the ones that are on the TrimUI Smart Pro. Those ones come in at 6.8mm, and this is about as small as I'd go while maintaining some level of comfort while using the buttons. So it's a nice step up over the TrimUI Smart Pro. These are exactly the same size buttons as the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, 7.2mm, 7.2mm. The Odin 2 is slightly bigger at 7.3. These also feel like different buttons completely. These feel like a lighter button overall. The Mini also feels light, but it does require a little bit more force to push it down. Not by a lot, and I think this is just kind of margin of error at this point. If you like the Odin 2 face buttons, these pretty much feel identical. If we look really close, you can see that these aren't rubbing onto the edge of the device. A little bit of wiggle, but not enough that it would be problematic. You want a little bit so you don't get any button wear. I actually really like how these buttons sound, so let me do a quick sound test so you can see what these sound like as well. These quiet rubber membrane buttons feel really nice. These aren't really loud by any means either, and I don't think they're going to bother anyone. The D-pad is also super quiet. So all in all, yeah, I like the buttons and I love the controls. I think they've done a really good job. Speaking of those triggers, they're really well designed. They don't squeak when I push them down from any angle. They're really smooth. They also don't make a loud bottoming out sound when I push them down really quick. They do have a nice flare to them. Not enough that it would be problematic for portability reasons, but a good amount of flare so it's nice and comfortable to use. You want a little bit, but you don't want too much. The TrimUI Smart Pro is definitely borderline acceptable. These are very small triggers and they barely have any flare to them whatsoever. They're also much louder. I do prefer the triggers on the Odin 2 Mini. Just to show you that difference a little bit more, that's quite drastic. However, if you compare these triggers to the Odin 2, yeah, the Odin 2 has some bigger triggers. I would say they have very similar amount of flare on them though, and they feel very similar. This has the same amount of travel to it, but these are very close. I think both of these are very good. So what about the triggers on the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro? These barely have any flare to them, and they stick up much higher. If I had to pick between these two, I kind of like the Odin 2 Mini triggers. I don't mind the triggers on the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, but they do make a sound when you press them down quick. They also don't squeak when you press them from any angle, but that sound that they make when you bottom them out just doesn't sound as nice as the Odin 2 Mini. There's a little bit of a sound, but this is still a fantastic trigger. AYN did an incredible job with this. Just before we look at these bumpers, these are not final. AYN has told me that these are not the ones that are going to be on the retail unit, but I really don't see much of a problem with these. They have a nice dome click to them. They also don't have any issues from pressing them from any angle. I can press this anywhere, and it just works. I also like the clear transparent plastic, in contrast to the dark matte triggers. I think that's a pretty cool design choice. However, with clear plastic obviously comes fingerprints, and this is going to show a few. But I don't mind these at all. I actually thought I'd hate these bumpers, but they're not bad. Not bad at all. If we compare these to the Redefined Pocket 4 Pro, these become harder to push near the top. These sit on a little lever, and they become much easier to press the further you go out. Compared to the bumpers on the TrimUI Smart Pro, these kind of have the same kind of feel to them as the Odin 2 Mini. These are more of a hollow click though, as opposed to a dome switch. They also feel similar throughout. So if you know what these feel like, well, imagine these but slightly clickier, and that's what they're like on the Odin 2 Mini. The ones on the Odin 2 have a similar dome style switch click, but they're much louder. These also have more of a hollow click to them, whereas the bumper on the Odin 2 Mini feels like it's more insulated. In my opinion, AYN did a really good job on these. The D-pad is also pretty special on this device. It has a very retro-like Vita D-pad, and it feels like rubber membrane too. It has a nice hollow click to it. It's a little mushy, but I actually kind of like that. It is a clear plastic though, and as you can see, it's definitely picking up some of my fingerprints. It's got lots of space around it, so as you roll it, it's not going to rub on the edge of the shell. You can also see some subtle arrow designs underneath the plastic itself. I do really like this D-pad though, actually. In fact, the D-pad on the Odin 2 feels pretty much identical to it. Just for comparison's sake, this sits at 19.2 on the old Odin 2. It's pretty much the same at 19.3 on the Odin 2 Mini. I'm actually really happy that they didn't shrink the size on this. Any smaller than this just would have been too small. Another area that I really like this D-pad is on the edges. They kind of flare out on the edge, and this adds to the overall comfort. Yeah, it's a pretty nice D-pad. The TrimUI Smart Pro also has a very similar D-pad in the fact that it flares up on the edges. The D-pad on this though is much smaller at only 18mm. The Redefined Pocket 4 Pro D-pad also feels very similar to the Odin 2 and the Odin 2 Mini. It comes in at 19.2mm. It also has a very similar flared edge to it. So the ergonomics were an area on this device that I was very concerned about. Having no grips on the back and a smaller design from the Odin 2 was kind of concerning to me. With these rounded edges though, it does feel very comfy. The joystick on the left is nicely placed for this size, and the face buttons feel good too with that. However, if I'm using anything on the bottom, like this bottom joystick or this D-pad, you almost have to move your hands down a little bit. But I still think they're very easy to use, and it's still very comfortable. As far as how I hold this, I find my fingers just kind of resting on the bottom like this. Whereas on the Odin 2, I can wrap my hands around the grips. You can also spread your hands on the back, and that still feels very comfortable as well. And you can kind of see how I'm holding this if I turn it around. There's lots of room on the back to spread out your hands, and because this is grippy plastic, it's easy to hold on to. I can't say how concerned I was about the ergonomics on this device, but yeah, this is not too bad at all. I really missed owning my PlayStation Vita that I bought in Japan, and this is giving me major Vita vibes. If I had to rate these four devices ergonomically, I would say that the Odin 2 definitely takes the top spot. These grips on the back are extremely comfortable, and I do like the large screen. However, with the D-pad and the joystick on this device, I do have to position my hands a little further down if I want to use them. But with these grips, it just makes it so much easier to grab onto. AYN definitely set a gold standard for ergonomics on ARM devices with the Odin 2. Coming in second place for comfort, I would say the Odin 2 Mini does a really good job. As mentioned, these nice round edges make it comfortable to hold, and it's easy to slide your hands down if you want to use the D-pad or the other joystick. There's also many ways to hold it, even without the grips on the back because of the shape and the overall size. This is a very comfortable device. Coming in third place is the Redefined Pocket 4 Pro. This has no grips on the back either, but the square design makes it a little awkward to hold, and that does kind of jut into the corners of your palms. Last on the list in terms of comfort is the TrimUI Smart Pro. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. This is a very comfortable device, and honestly, I might actually put this over the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, just because of these rounded edges. I really like this on the device, especially if it doesn't have grips on the back. It lets it sit very comfortably in the palm of your hand. I've been pretty impressed with the Odin 2 Mini so far in terms of just the overall device and what it is. But we haven't turned this on yet, and that's obviously the best part. So what I want to do next is to do a quick setup and show you some of the tweaks that I use on this device to get it running in really good shape. So let's turn this on and take a closer look at this mini LED as well, just to see how good it is. And how does the panel on this stack up to the competition? Let's turn this on and go through a quick setup. The first thing you're going to be greeted with is the AYN logo. And I can already tell there's barely any blooming. First thing you're going to have to do is to go through a quick setup on the device. So let's go through that now. It's going to ask you for your language. Then let's connect to our Wi-Fi. On my 6 GHz band over Wi-Fi 6E, I'm getting a 1.2 gigabits per second connection, which is not too bad at all. As soon as I turned it on though, I did see that dark edge, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. So let's go ahead and select our time zone. Now we have to select the launcher. I'm just going to use the AOSP launcher because I want to put my own. Retroid and AYN devices have always had issues with the gesture navigation. I would just recommend using 3-button navigation for now. I'm going to go ahead and select that and complete the setup. Now everything's working, let's take a closer look at this panel. Look how bright this panel is. Wow! Look how sharp that looks. The colors are extremely bright. There's no blooming around this black part. First things first, before you set up your device, double check it for screen issues. Turn the brightness up completely. Now let's go around the screen and just double check for any issues. You want to look for any issues around light bleed on the edges. This panel looks to be pretty good. You also want to look for any dead pixels, and I am not seeing any on mine at all. Another thing that you're going to notice is when you're directly looking at the screen like you are now, it looks absolutely fine. But when you turn it, you are going to notice those dark edges. Hold it directly in front of you and you're not going to probably have any issues with that. I also wanted to check the contrast before we jump any further into the review. And I downloaded the same image that I had in my Lenovo Legion Go review because I know what this is supposed to look like with nice contrast. I really like an oversaturated display, but the whites are also kind of being blown out here, and the colors actually aren't that vibrant. I was kind of hoping that this display was going to blow me away. This is a nice display, don't get me wrong, but I just kind of wish this was a little bit more vibrant. I'm going to turn on the dark theme just to combat those edges. I'm also going to go to the colors and I'm going to turn on screen enhancement. On 50% brightness, the colors look much more accurate and they're not overblown by the backlight. Brightness wise, here's 50%. It's not ruining any of the photo details. 60% is where it starts to degrade. At 75%, it's already way too bright. But let's do a quick setup on the device. So you've signed into your Google account and you've done the basic setup at the beginning. Under the battery, I do recommend turning off the battery saver and shut off the battery manager as well. In the storage, make sure to turn off the storage manager. In the sound and vibration options, there's a few things that I like to adjust. I like to turn off the vibration and haptics. Charging screen sounds and vibration, I shut that off. Locking screen sound, and I like to turn off the touch sounds as well. In the display options, brightness is obviously going to be your personal preference. We kind of went over what that does to the display and the colors. I do recommend turning on this dark theme. In your color options, we already set it to screen enhancement, but I really don't notice a difference between any 3 of these modes. Auto rotate screen I like to have shut off, and I also like to shut off the screensaver. At the very bottom, there's also a Qualcomm color profile. If you scroll down the settings a little more, you're going to see the Odin settings. Click on that. This is going to let us adjust things like the vibration strength, the charging LED notification, and what kind of HDMI output we can get. I recommend leaving this to default, but you can adjust this depending on your screen. You can also turn off the handheld screen when it's connected to HDMI, and it'll also disable the sleep function. I also like to show the current network speeds so I kind of know what I'm downloading these apps at. For controller style, I'm going to leave mine to Xbox. The R2 and L2 mode, make sure to leave that to both. Because this is the Pro model, I can leave off this virtual RAM swap, but if you're using the base model, you might want to turn this on. It uses the UFS storage in this to expand that integrated memory up 4 gigabytes. By default, without anything installed, I'm using 10% of my storage, so I have 232 gigs free. I'm also using on average around 2.3 gigabytes in the background just for system resources. As of currently making this review, there's no update for this device. This home button on the bottom left immediately lets you go back to the main menu. You have to press it twice though. The one beside it is the back option, so that's going to close or go back a page to whatever you have. We also have the select and the start button on the bottom right corner. And there's also a small microphone at the top left. Speakers are on the front, on the bottom, so we should get some good audio with this. So I'm just going to do a quick setup on this and I'll be right back with the fully set up device. Now that I have the device fully set up, let's do a quick boot test to see how quick it starts. I was pretty impressed with the Odin 2's boot speed, and since this is using the same UFS storage type, we should be seeing pretty similar results. Let's go ahead and shut this off and compare it to the Odin 2 to see which one's quicker. Ready? Here we go. I think these are going to be identical, so it's going to be interesting to see if there's any comparison. Well, that was very interesting. I didn't expect to see the Odin 2 start up quicker, but this has had more updates, so hopefully after a few, this one should be a little quicker too. Next up, I'm going to test the internal storage speeds and the memory itself. I'm going to use this app called A1 SD Benchmark. This should let us see just how quick this is. So first up is the original Odin 2. The internal memory on this one has a read speed of 2,487 megabytes per second, and it has a write speed of 633 megabytes per second. If we compare that to the Odin 2 Mini, the Mini has 2,420 megabytes per second read and 710 megabytes per second writes. The RAM speed on the Odin 2 Mini comes in at 62,000 megabytes per second. That's pretty dang quick. And the RAM speed on the Odin comes in at 70,000 megabytes per second. These are pretty close, so I don't really think that's going to make too much of a difference. Next up, we need to look at the speakers. The speakers on this handheld are probably by far the best speakers I've ever heard. If we're talking about an ARM device, I would go as far as to say that this probably beats the Odin 2, and that was the previous champion, I think. Let me show you what this sounds like, but bear in mind this gets extremely loud, so I'm going to turn down the volume to 50%. Just to show you how good this one is, I think we should start with the original Odin 2, then I'll jump back to the Odin 2 Mini. We're essentially getting the same kind of volume we are from the Odin 2, but we're getting much more power behind it. This, to me, sounds way more bassy, and it also sounds a little bit cleaner. The trebles aren't clipping off at higher volumes as they are on the Odin 2. I think it's mostly because of the way they built the speakers into the device itself, maybe. They aren't harsh, and the Odin 2 and the Odin 2 Mini both have really good speakers. You won't be disappointed by either. But for now, I think the Odin 2 Mini takes the crown for the best audio. Both of these devices are able to do 4K HDR, no issues whatsoever. You do see a pretty drastic quality difference between these two panels. If we're looking at brightness quality and black levels, well, the Mini LED is obviously going to win. I've shut off all my lights so you can see the black level differences. The Odin 2 is on the bottom and the Odin 2 Mini is on the top. The Odin 2 Mini is showing colors really nice in HDR and the brightness is much better. I think they did a fantastic job, at least with the HDR part. Since the bottom panel is an IPS screen, it doesn't have any local dimming. That means effectively that the Odin 2 panel has to completely illuminate all the time. But since the Odin 2 Mini has local dimming, it can just shut off zones when it doesn't need anything there. Because the zones on the screen on the Mini are only so big, you do get a little bit of blooming around it. However, if we look closely, the white square on the IPS panel is much brighter though. You're going to notice a pretty big difference in brightness too. Even though the mini panel is brighter, it does have to shut off zones as the object gets smaller. This makes details a lot darker, whereas the IPS just illuminates the whole panel. You're still going to get bright details, as opposed to the mini LED that's dimming it and making it look a lot darker than what it should be. Because the zones are only so big, this is a good way to test blooming. We effectively have a black background and it's doing a really good job, but as this brightens up, you are going to notice a little bit of bloom around the different white details. As this gets brighter, this becomes more apparent. I've left the screen at 100%, so the 1000 nits, you are going to notice a little bit of blooming. And for me anyways, even after this YouTube video finishes, the little rewatch icon has some bloom around it. Anything small is going to see a little bit of bloom. The first time I saw this, I actually thought I had something in my eye and it was just a little blurry. This is very hard to show on film, so I hope this is coming across. But if you look near the bottom where the text is, it'll say 100 nits. At the very end of the text, you can see some of the text fading off. And that's because, of course, the S is very thin. It also has to shut off that zone near the end of the word. Part of that letter is going to be faded off. As this gets brighter to 500 nits, it doesn't actually look that bad. You are going to notice this a lot more as it gets dimmer. So because the panel's brighter, it has to keep blacks black. It has to make some pretty decisive decisions to which zones to shut off. At 1000 nits, the word looks much better, and the S doesn't seem to be fading off. So as far as local dimming goes, at the higher ends, you are going to notice more bloom around white, but you are going to notice the text is a lot better, so it's a big trade-off. At lower brightnesses, you're going to get less bloom, but the words are going to be faded off a little. At higher brightnesses, the words are going to look better, but you're going to get more bloom. So it really comes down to finding a balance between the two. I think a little over 50% is a really good balance. Even at 500 nits, it doesn't look too bad. So you definitely want it somewhere between 50 and 65% brightness to get a good balance. The brightness leads us to our first problem. This is just going to come down to personal preference, so what you're hearing now is my opinion, and your opinion might vary. I've set the panel to 100%, and this was with no saturation adjustments. This is the stock panel at max brightness. At least to me, I'm noticing a lot of the oranges and the colors are getting washed out just because the panel is so bright. It's overblowing this entire shot. I've also checked the metering on the camera, and I've double checked it with my eyes to make sure this looks as accurate as possible. I've checked with Retro the Tech Dad, and his unit does not look like this at max brightness, so it could just be my panel and there might be some slight variances. If I turn this down to 50%, a lot of that color comes back, so this is looking a lot better. As we saw with the local dimming test, you want to be somewhere between 50 and 65%. Anything over 65% is just going to be unusable, and it washes out way too much of the color, at least on my panel. As you can see at 75%, it's getting a little bright. This is the Odin and the Mini at max brightness with no saturation adjustments whatsoever. If we turn this down to 50% on the Odin 2 Mini and 100% on the Odin 2, it's pretty comparable. I do think that the Odin 2 has a little bit more vibrant colors on it. If we open Odin Tools and bump this up to about 1.3, I think 1.2 to 1.3 is going to give you slightly more vibrant colors than the Odin 2, but this is looking a lot better now. However, we still can't max the brightness on this without it washing out. You're going to have to find a balance between what kind of color you think looks good for you. Since I like a bright, vibrant panel, I'm going to leave this at 1.3 for the saturation adjustment, and I'm also going to have the brightness at about 60%. That looks pretty good to me. I usually have my Odin 2 at about 1.3 times as well. But with these screens both at 1.3, for me anyways, I find myself leaning more towards the Odin 2 screen. But what do you think about these two screens? Let me know in the comments below. Do you have one screen that you prefer over the other? And what do you think of the Odin 2 mini screen? This is another thing that's very hard to show on film, but if you look really closely, you can see some bloom around a lot of these icons. I didn't even notice this at first, but now that I saw it, it's pretty hard to unsee it. And this is just unfortunately a result of using a mini LED panel. This somewhat bothers me. Like I said, it's just going to come down to personal preference. A lot of people won't even see this. I've let AYN know about this as well. You might not be able to see it as bad on film, but yeah, I definitely notice it. I think this is usable. Anything 60% and below, but anything over 60% and we go right back to that local dimming test, it just gets too much bloom. But yes, I do think they used a good panel, and it's kind of cool to see mini LED tech in a handheld. But for me personally, I would have just gone for another IPS or OLED panel. I guess it's okay, I'm just not crazy about the screen. I also checked the refresh rate, and yes, this is a true 60Hz panel. I haven't had any ghosting or anything else, and it seems to move pretty smoothly. For me anyways, I don't notice a difference between the 60Hz on both of these. 60Hz looks exactly the same to me anyways, but do you notice a difference between these two? If you watch very closely behind this black circle, you're going to be able to see a little bit of the ghosting. It is adjusting pretty quickly, but let me try slowing this footage down so you can see it, especially on this black one here. I did want to take a look at this, but it's so subtle, I don't think it's going to bother anybody. This panel does support HDR on YouTube, and it will go up to 4K. I think SDR content like this looks fantastic on here, but HDR content looks even better. This is an absolutely outstanding panel for media content. As far as the Widevine Security, this is what we have available on this device. As far as performance goes, guys, I really haven't noticed any difference between this or the Odin 2. This thing maxed out every single game that I threw at it, and emulation handled no issues whatsoever. Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 is pretty much all the power you're going to ever need for emulation on Android. At least right now, we're just not going to need any more horsepower just yet with Android in general. These games look absolutely incredible on this device too. It genuinely feels like a proper handheld experience. But I stand by what I said on my Odin 2 review. If it runs on Android, it'll run on here no problem. Some of the best games that I've tried on here so far are Wreckfest, and of course this is Titan Quest. I think this is a fantastic Android game. You can max out the settings, and it has full controller support, so I definitely recommend checking this one out. The Odin 2 and the Odin 2 Mini are basically in-game handhelds as far as emulation or Android goes. If you want something just to be done with it, and you don't want to have to buy them every year, I can see this being very current and good enough for many years to come. I have to admit, I've been having a lot of fun with this. I took this to work with me the other day. Instead of my ROG Ally, I stuck it in my little Tomtoc bag, and there was just so much space in it, it felt like I didn't have anything in it. I think AYN did a really cool job on the design of this device. Panel criticisms aside, this is a really cool handheld. I'm going to leave this game running as I've been testing it for a little while with a few other heavy titles. I can tell you right now, this device is pretty warm. I don't think it's hot, but it's definitely getting to that point of where it's a little bit uncomfortable. So let's take a closer look at the temperatures and see what we're dealing with. I think anything over 32 to 33 on your hands is a little bit uncomfortable. On the right side, we're looking at 34 degrees Celsius, so this is a little uncomfortable. That's 94 degrees Fahrenheit. On the other side by the face buttons, we're sitting at about 32 to 33 degrees Celsius. This is about 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and the back is definitely where a lot of this heat is coming out. My hands are already starting to get clammy from using this thing because it's just so warm. So since we flip this around, this is the right side. So on the right side by this grip, we're looking at around 35 degrees Celsius. But if we move off a little bit, we're jumping up to 38. This stays pretty consistent throughout the back, so 38 is about where it's going to peak. 38 degrees Celsius is definitely warm. That's about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. On the other side, that's 98 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius. The hottest part is up by the vents. This is coming out to about 47 degrees Celsius or 116 degrees Fahrenheit. The other vent doesn't seem to be as hot for some reason. Most of it seems to be coming out of this one. So yes, this is a little warm, and I would definitely feel this if I was playing a heavy game. As I pick this up, I immediately felt that temperature on the back. Yes, this is definitely a warm device. However, the parts that are actually touching your fingers, the inputs themselves, aren't too bad. The buttons are still pretty cool. Yeah, so this is just borderline acceptable at around 33 degrees Celsius. And of course, the joysticks are pretty similar at around 33.5 Celsius, or 92 degrees Fahrenheit. Even with the fan on smart, this is still getting a little warm. Personally, I wouldn't see any use in turning this up to high performance mode. I don't think the fan should be on anything else except for smart, unless you're playing a really demanding game. I just usually leave these devices in performance mode and just set the fan to smart. I'm barely hearing the fan noise too, and I don't even think I could pick that up on camera. Sport mode is a little loud, but it's quieter than the one that's on the Redefined Pocket 4 Pro. Next up, I think we need to test the charging out. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to leave this in hibernate mode first, and we're going to go all out with the charging. This is what I'm going to use for the charger, just to eliminate any bottlenecks. This is a 140 watt fast charger from Alhi, and this is the fastest charger that I own. They just sent this over for me to take a look at and to use in my videos to check out the charging speeds of devices. Let's open this up and check it out. I've always loved Alhi's packaging. It's very professional. And the charger looks fantastic too. So I'm going to plug this in and let's try to get a reading on this device just to see how good it is. I got two USB-C ports, so this is what I'm going to use to check the charging speed on this device. If we have a good charger, we also have to have a cable that will support that charging speed. I'm also going to use their cables that they just sent over as well because these support 240 watt fast charging. These are also USB 4 cables, so they'll support 40 gigabits per second data transfer and 8K resolution video out. These are also completely modular too, so I'm going to build one of these cables and we're going to see what this is capable of. This is a really cool cable actually. It's got metal tipped ends and it's extremely malleable. So I'm just going to plug this in so we can get a long enough cable and let's check it out. Okay, so I plugged this in and this is pretty interesting. I actually expected a little quicker charging, but we're looking at around 8.5 volts at 3 amps with 25 watt quick charging. Let's take a closer look and see what the Odin 2 is capable of. Both of these devices charge at exactly the same speed. There can be some subtle differences when the device is shut off completely, so I've gone ahead and shut that down. Now let's plug it in and see if that's getting a little different. So with the device completely shut off and charging, we're looking at around 8.5 volts, 3 watts, 25 watt quick charging, exactly the same. So 25 watt quick charging seems to be the fastest device is capable of. As I haven't had this device very long, I really can't comment on the battery too much, but it's been excellent so far. And standby time has been pretty good too. After gaming, I can put this in my travel bag, and when I have a chance, I can pick it back up again, and it's only really gone down maybe about 1% every couple hours, so standby time is pretty decent. So this is a tiny little device, and it's got a lot of power going for it. What kind of accessories can you use on this? I like these little Skull & Co caps for the Nintendo Switch. These fit on the Redefined Pocket 4 Pro, and since it's the same joysticks in this device, you can use them on this. And they don't seem to affect the range of motion at all, but as you can see, that adds a lot to the joystick height. As long as you don't mind having these rubber caps on there, I think these are a really worthwhile purchase. This will make modern gaming or any gaming that uses the joysticks a lot better. And just because of how comfortable these are, I'll probably end up using them on my device too. You got your joystick caps on there, and that's definitely helping your gaming experience, but what else do you need? Well, you're going to need a good way to carry it around. What I find works best is Tomtoc sling cases. They're really easy to pocket your electronics and take with you on the go. So let's take a look at the smaller one that I have. This is Tomtoc's sling case for the Steam Deck, and it's pretty dang big, so you got lots of room in here to take all your electronics. The Mini just fits in the back, and it's so small in there, you can almost lose it. It's actually comically small, but that fits in there nice, and you got lots of room for everything else. I've been using this thin little charger from Alhi because it fits in this little pocket, but any thin charger should work really nice. There's also a pocket in the front, and that's a really good spot to fit your power bank or anything else. In the front pocket here, it's a good idea to bring some cables, and what I've been doing actually is bringing the official AYN cable now. I believe this supports 100 watt charging, so this is definitely something that would work really well with my x86 gaming devices too. I also have my power bank in there, and I put it in a little pouch. And I really can't recommend SoundPeats earbuds enough. I don't notice any latency gaming with these. I put them in game mode, and they got a really good battery too. So I got my power bank, my headphones, and a USB cable. all in a nice package, and I could definitely fit another handheld in here too. In fact, if I was using my power bank in the outer pocket, I could probably fit my Game Boy in here too. I've had mine for about 6 months at this point, and it's holding up pretty good. There's a little bit of wear on the front, but I don't think it's too bad. There's some nice buckles, and a comfortable strap for it too. If you're taking something that small and you don't need your power bank or anything else, you might want to look at one of their smaller bags. But as for me, this is the one I like, and that's the one I've been taking with my Odin 2 Mini. So who do I think this handheld is for? If you want a small handheld with some pretty decent ergonomics and a lot of power, it's really hard to beat the Odin 2 Mini. If you don't mind the trade-offs with the screen, and of course you're getting a slightly smaller battery life. But to be honest guys, I haven't had this very long and it hasn't bothered me at all. This will easily make it through an entire workday and then some, probably quite a few work days actually if you're only playing on your lunches. But it's small enough to take with you in your pocket. It's not a bad little device. The very few complaints that I have on this device are just basically the screen. With those saturation adjustments set to 1.3, I find the contrast pretty decent. The bloom isn't too bad as long as you keep it under 65% brightness, and you definitely want to keep it over 50, just so you don't lose your text. If you get the brightness too much, then you're going to lose a little bit of your color. But I think they're going to be updating this device pretty soon, and this device hasn't had any updates since I've gotten it. The only other negative for some people might be this matte black plastic. But to be honest guys, it's really not that bad. My lights in my studio make it extremely hot in here, and even in 30-degree weather, this thing is not picking up a lot of fingerprints, especially where I am. I live at a pretty dry part of Canada, so I'm going to get some smudges, but not a lot. But they wipe off pretty easy and they don't really show. This is obviously going to change if you live somewhere humid, but if you live in a dry climate like me, I don't think it's going to bother you. These little rubber pads add quite a lot of grip to it. There's a nice vent on the back. We have a quiet fan. The controls are all very comfortable to use. The ergonomics are pretty good, and I don't find myself complaining about that at all. We have excellent front-facing speakers. There's very little to not like about the Odin 2 Mini. I find myself in an interesting situation because I like the Odin 2, but it's too big to be portable for a lot of situations, so this fills that niche. It is a little bit more expensive than the Odin 2, and I think we're actually getting to the borderline of where these ARM devices are just getting a little too expensive. If you can justify the price, this is a great little handheld. At least for me, I'm pretty happy with this, and I can see myself using this for many years. Special thanks to AYN again for sending this over for me to take a look at. I love their handhelds. I think they do a great job designing these. So what do you guys think about the Odin 2 Mini? Let me know in the comments below. Is it worth it to you? Or would you just rather stick to the regular Odin 2? Does this provide too much of a trade-off in ergonomics, or do you think it's good enough? I'm usually really picky about my ergonomics on my devices. If this doesn't bother me with this trade-off, I don't think it's going to bother a lot of people. In fact, this is decent enough that even if they came out with an add-on grip, I don't think I would buy it. If you have any questions regarding the Odin 2 or the Mini, let me know in the comments below. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future videos, and as always, thanks for watching.